Locked inside a block of sandstone in Mongolia's Gobi Desert is the single most direct piece of evidence ever recovered of one dinosaur killing another, a Velociraptor and a Protoceratops, frozen mid-combat. The Velociraptor's sickle-shaped claw driven into its opponent's neck, while the Protoceratops's beak is clamped down around the Velociraptor's forelimb. Both animals were buried alive together, almost certainly by a collapsing sand dune, somewhere between 75 and 71 million years ago, and preserved in that exact locked position ever since. Discovered on August 3, 1971, by a joint Polish-Mongolian expedition at a locality called Tugrikin Shirei, the specimen known as the fighting dinosaurs remains one of the rarest fossils ever found anywhere on Earth, not a skeleton lying peacefully in rock, not a footprint, but an actual frozen instant of predation caught mid-strike. And the animal captured in that fight looks almost nothing like the version that later made this species famous. Real Velociraptor mongoliensis stood about 2 feet tall at the hip, stretched roughly 6.8 feet long, and weighed somewhere around 33 pounds, smaller than most breeds of large dog. It was covered in feathers from its arms to its tail, hunted using scent and an acutely tuned sense of hearing, and looked far closer to an oversized, flightless hawk than to anything that has ever appeared on a movie screen. No 6-foot-tall scaly monster, no pack of reptilian commandos the size of a grown man coordinating ambushes with human-like cunning. Velociraptor lived across an arid, wind-scoured Cretaceous landscape that resembled a modern desert far more than the lush jungle most films set it in, and in the decades since its extinction, the actual science has quietly rebuilt this animal from the ground up, one fossil at a time, into something almost unrecognizable from its own Hollywood reputation. The obstacle that defines Velociraptor research at the molecular level is the same one facing every other non-avian dinosaur: the DNA itself. Genetic material has a hard ceiling on preservation, degrading beyond recovery after roughly 1 to 1.5 million years, even under the most favorable cold, dry conditions. Velociraptor's extinction sits at least 50 times beyond that outer limit, a gap that no advance in laboratory technique has ever managed to close for any dinosaur this old. Whatever genetic code this animal carried is gone permanently, and no method available to science now or in any foreseeable future can bring it back. But the molecular revolution that reshaped how paleontology understands dinosaurs never actually needed Velociraptor's own genome to reach this animal. It arrived instead through the DNA of the living animals sitting closest to it on the family tree: birds. If you are finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. Genomic and protein level comparisons across living birds, reptiles, and fossil theropods, including the same collagen sequencing techniques that confirmed Tyrannosaurus rex's place among modern birds through analysis published in 2007 and 2008, had already established that this entire branch of dinosaurs shared a direct, close ancestry with everything currently living in a nest. Velociraptor belongs to the Dromaeosaurid family, one of the closest non-avian relatives to birds anywhere in the dinosaur family tree, a placement first proposed on skeletal anatomy alone decades earlier by paleontologist John Ostrom, whose work in the 1960s and 70s on a related Dromaeosaurid, Deinonychus antiropus, helped launch what became known as the dinosaur renaissance, the period when the field broadly abandoned the image of dinosaurs as sluggish, cold-blooded reptiles in favor of active, bird-like animals capable of speed and complex behavior. Molecular evidence arriving decades later through entirely separate laboratory methods working on entirely different specimens reinforced that same conclusion from a completely different direction. Converging on the same family tree, Ostrom had sketched out using nothing but bone shape and joint mechanics. What Velociraptor itself was still missing, even with that molecular and anatomical backing already in place, was direct physical, skeletal proof to match the picture painted by its living relatives' DNA. In 2007, that proof finally arrived from a single forearm bone that had been sitting in a museum drawer for nearly a decade after it was first dug out of the ground. The bone was a Velociraptor ulna, catalogued as IG M10981, recovered from Mongolia's Jurassic formation in 1998. It sat unremarkable for years until paleontologists Alan Turner, Peter Makovicky, and Mark Norell examined it closely and found 6 evenly spaced bumps running along its length, spaced roughly 4 millimeters apart. These bumps, called quill knobs, are the exact anchor points that secondary flight feathers attach to in living birds, clearly visible on the forearm of a turkey vulture used for direct comparison in the study, right down to the ligament attachments holding each quill in place. Turner's team estimated the complete row of knobs would have anchored around 14 feathers along the arm, arranged the same way flight feathers are arranged on a modern bird's wing, despite Velociraptor having no ability to fly whatsoever. The team published their findings in the journal Science on September 21, 2007, and the significance went well beyond simply confirming Velociraptor had feathers. Feather impressions typically only survive in extremely fine-grained sediment, the kind found in Lagerstätten like Liaoning, China, where small, delicate Dromaeosaurs have left detailed feather outlines pressed directly into the rock. Mongolia's Jurassic formation is coarse desert sandstone, the kind of environment that preserves bone beautifully but destroys soft impressions almost immediately after burial, which is exactly why no Velociraptor fossil has ever shown a visible feather impression despite dozens of specimens being recovered from the site over the past century. Quill knobs solved that preservation problem entirely because the proof was written directly into the bone itself rather than into the fragile tissue surrounding it. This was the first direct skeletal evidence of feathers in a larger-bodied, flightless member of this dinosaur group, extending confirmed feather evidence into an environment that had never been expected to preserve any trace of it at all, and forcing a reconsideration of how many other feathered dinosaurs from similarly coarse sediment might be sitting in museum collections, already excavated, simply never checked for this specific kind of bone-level evidence. That same year, and for years afterward, the version of this animal reaching the public was moving in the opposite direction entirely. The Velociraptor most people know was never actually built from Velociraptor at all. In 1988, paleo artist Gregory Paul published a book called Predatory Dinosaurs of the World, in which he controversially reclassified a much larger North American dinosaur, Deinonychus antieuropus, as a species within the genus Velociraptor, despite the two animals being separated by roughly 30 million years of time and an entire ocean's width of geography, one from Mongolia and one from Montana and Wyoming. The broader paleontological community never accepted that reclassification, and Deinonychus remains its own distinct genus to this day, entirely separate from true Velociraptor, a point paleontologists have continued to make in interviews and documentaries for decades since, without ever fully catching up to the version already lodged in public memory. But author Michael Crichton read Paul's book while researching his novel Jurassic Park, credited Paul directly in the book's acknowledgments, and built his fictional raptors using Deinonychus's much larger proportions under the borrowed name Velociraptor. Steven Spielberg's film adaptation then enlarged the animal again for the screen, reportedly because the director felt Deinonychus's real dimensions were not imposing enough for the camera. The actual Velociraptor mongoliensis, first named in 1924 by paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History, based on fossils recovered during Roy Chapman Andrews' expeditions into the Gobi Desert, measures approximately 6.8 feet long and stands roughly 1.6 feet tall at the hip, weighing around 33 pounds, smaller than most breeds of large dog. Its famous curved claw, mounted on the second toe of each foot, measures about 3 inches along the outside curve, a formidable weapon on an animal that size, but nothing close to the sword-length blade shown in film close-ups. The pop culture monster and the real animal share nothing more than a borrowed name. Even the animal's signature weapon has been revised since those early depictions. Comparative studies of the claw's bony core against the keratin sheaths preserved on the claws of living birds of prey suggest the actual functional claw in life was covered by a horn-like sheath that extended meaningfully beyond the bone alone, changing both its length and its curvature from what the fossilized bone by itself would suggest. A detail invisible on the bone, only skeletal mounts long displayed in museums before that comparison was made. Even Velociraptor's own hunting method has shifted in the scientific literature over time, moving away from the coordinated pack hunting behavior popularized on screen and toward a picture closer to solitary or loosely opportunistic hunting, more consistent with what is typically seen in living birds of prey than with the tightly synchronized group ambushes shown in film. The fighting dinosaur specimen itself supports that picture directly. It preserves a single velociraptor against a single protoceratops, a one-on-one confrontation frozen in stone, with no evidence anywhere in the block of a supporting pack waiting nearby. Subscribe to not miss the next one. The most recent chapter in rebuilding this animal came not from a new bone, but from looking inside one already sitting in a museum collection. In 2020, researchers used CT scanning to digitally reconstruct the interior of a partial Velociraptor braincase specimen I GM 10976 recovered from the Jadochta formation at a site called Tugrugian Shirech, missing several of the bones toward the front of the skull, but preserving enough of the rear structure to build a usable model. The resulting three-dimensional model revealed that the floccular lobes, the brain structures most associated with balance and rapid motion tracking in living animals, made up 42% of the length of the hindbrain and 7% of the total brain volume reconstructed from the scan. Proportions consistent with an animal built for fast, precise, coordinated movement rather than raw strength, more comparable to an agile modern bird of prey than to a slower moving reptile. The same study found the inner ear closely resembled that of modern flightless birds, with an estimated hearing range comparable to a raven's, suggesting Velociraptor could pick up a broad range of sounds useful for tracking prey and communicating across open terrain. Separate examinations of Velociraptor skulls have documented an enlarged olfactory bulb as well, indicating a strong sense of smell, likely used for locating carcasses or tracking wounded prey over distance, rounding out a sensory profile built for patient, precise hunting rather than the brute chase depicted on screen. None of this required a single strand of DNA to uncover. It required a scanner capable of seeing through solid bone, applied to a skull that had been sitting in a drawer since its excavation, waiting for imaging technology to finally catch up to what the bone had been quietly holding onto the entire time. Put together, these separate lines of evidence describe an animal built almost entirely differently from its own reputation. Velociraptor was small enough to be mistaken for a large bird of prey at a glance, covered in feathers that anchored directly into its forearm bones, the same way a hawk's do today, agile enough that nearly half its hindbrain was dedicated to processing fast, coordinated movement, and equipped with hearing and smell, tuned for tracking prey across open desert terrain rather than pack hunting through dense jungle underbrush the way the films depict. The monster audiences have spent more than 3 decades associating with this name was never actually built from Velociraptor's own proportions in the first place, borrowed instead from a larger, more distantly related animal that lived 30 million years earlier on a different continent, then enlarged again for dramatic effect on screen. And the actual fossil evidence recovered in the years since has moved in the opposite direction from that reputation every single time it has been tested. Smaller, more bird-like, and far more precisely adapted than the myth ever gave it credit for. The DNA that ties this animal to every bird alive today was never sitting inside Velociraptor's own bones, waiting decades for some future technology to finally extract it the way researchers eventually managed with Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops. That path was never available here and never will be. Instead, the connection was proven from the opposite direction entirely. The genetic evidence came from the living animals flying overhead the whole time, and the fossil record simply had to catch up, one bone at a time, to confirm what that genetic evidence had already implied. A single ulna with six small bumps did more to correct the public record than 3 decades of films ever did to distort it, and the science has kept building on that correction ever since, one scan, one bone, and one overturned assumption at a time. The animal locked in combat with a Protoceratops in that block of Mongolian sandstone was never the monster that later carried its name into theaters. It was something stranger and, in its own way, more remarkable. A feathered, bird brained, house cat sized hunter that still managed, in its very last recorded moment, to leave behind the single clearest picture of a dinosaur kill ever pulled out of the ground.